Death by Cakes, previously published as Piece of Cake.
Written by Clementine Moore and published by Starfall Publications. Book 2 from Ginger Burnet, Cozy Mystery Series. Save more with our ebook and audiobook bundles on our website, starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy.
Chapter 1. Chiswick Park Academy was a hive of excitement. After a quiet summer housing only international boarding students with no plans to return home for the holidays, students had flooded back in a tsunami of chatter, shrieked reunions, and the clatter of hundreds of feet on ancient stone floors. The current eye of the storm was in the Academy's chapel. On this second week of September, the first week of the new term, for those students that attended the Academy, there had been a variety of special events arranged. Today was an exclusive Harvest Festival-style event to showcase the best of the high-quality produce and artisan creators that this particular patch of Gloucestershire, England, had to offer. From her display table in the chancel, Ginger Burnet watched with no small amount of amusement as George Harvey, the headmaster of the Academy, blushed and stammered his way through an interview with the film crew from BBC Southwest. The Academy, at the suggestion of several members of the faculty, had invited beloved local television personality Sarah Sontag to report on the event. She was well known on both a local and national level as a vocal proponent of buying local and supporting independent small businesses. According to Ginger's close art teacher friend Bonnie Nat, who was far more tapped into the gossip around the Academy, Sarah had leapt at the chance to attend the event with a film crew in tow. "I wonder if Harvey thought he'd get dragged up in front of the cameras?" Bonnie asked, glancing up at the visibly uncomfortable headmaster, while she helped Ginger arrange her display of stunningly beautiful and delicate cakes. The way he's sweating and the fact that he wore that tie he hates suggests he didn't, and also that he might be behind on laundry. Ginger briefly delayed her chuckle of amusement. She narrowed her hazel eyes in concentration, tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth slightly. With the most delicate movements, she finished placing the tiny marzipan sculpture of a sleeping field mouse into position. Stepping back, she admired the 4-tier cake the Academy had commissioned from her specially for the event, each of the tiers bearing a countryside tableau of creatures great and small, all lovingly crafted out of marzipan, fondant icing, or chocolate. "I think our dear headmaster was very much hoping to stay behind the scenes in this instance," Ginger commented, carefully placing one of the several wheat stalks she had crafted out of melted sugar and edible paint around the sleeping mouse. "Poor George." "Poor George indeed," Bonnie echoed, stretching up on tiptoe as she finished assembling the large canvas backdrop of the rolling Gloucestershire countryside that she had painted for the cake of the rolling Gloucestershire countryside. "Amelia, can you please hook up that other side for me?" The 16-year-old, after a year of helping Ginger in the Melville House Cafe on campus and attending Ginger's classes the previous term, had become an unofficial apprentice at some point over the summer. Now, she looked up from where she was hand-drawing a sign for the cake display using chalk paints, the warm yellow of her head wrap bringing out the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. Wiping off her hands, she quickly hurried over to the other side of the table, helping Bonnie attach the landscape painting onto the display frame to form the background for the cake. "That looks incredible," commented the woman to Ginger's left, who, according to her charmingly rustic sign, made organic jams, preserves, syrups, and pickles using only local produce. "I keep expecting all the little creatures to start moving at any moment." "Thank you," Ginger beamed, shaking her soft chestnut bangs out of her face. "Seeing people enjoy it makes all the late nights of sculpting worth it." "She's been shut in her garage for the last week making the critters," Bonnie pointed out, a note of pride in her voice. "I think her actual cats were starting to question if they were real with all these sugary impersonators around the house." "I made one of the rabbits," Amelia added proudly, turning to point to a slightly lumpy Leporidae on the second, summer-themed tier. As she did so, her hip bumped the corner of the table, sending a jar of jam careening onto the floor. The sound of breaking glass, muffled wetly by the contents of the jar, caused several heads to turn. Even Sarah Sontag, over by the open doors of the chapel, glanced away from her interview with the specialist, organic free-range butcher who was catering the event. Amelia looked from the mess on the floor to Ginger, aghast. "I'm so sorry," she said, sinking her teeth into the pillow of her lower lip. "I know that was the last of the cherry jam." Ginger held up her hands calmingly. "It's fine," she said. "It was only for the taster cakes. I'll go and find some more from the kitchen somewhere. You go and find someone to help clean up the glass and the jam, okay?" "There's a bunch of cleaning stuff in a closet in the teacher's lounge," Bonnie said, leading a still apologising Amelia away. "I'll let you in." Carefully, Ginger crouched down and started gathering the larger shards of glass together in a pile. "Need a hand?" The woman from the next table hurried over, a newspaper and plastic bag in hand. "I have some things on hand for accidents like this. Kind of a hazard when I'm moving all of these jams and pickles around." "You're an angel." Using the paper, Ginger scooped up the worst of the glass-riddled jam. "Thank you so much." "Katrina," the woman replied. "Katrina Blythe." If Ginger had to guess, she would say that Katrina was somewhere in her 50s, but looking very good. Her thin, straight blonde hair seemed far from silvered, and the weathered skin on her face and hands boasted that she still spent a great deal of time in the great outdoors. "Yes, I guessed Blythe might be in your name somewhere," Ginger said, nodding to Katrina's sign. "Blythe Spirit? Lovely name for your business. I'm still working on mine. Unfortunately, my surname isn't an option, since having Burnet in the name of your cake-making business doesn't inspire confidence." Katrina chuckled, laugh lines appearing around her thin-lipped mouth and around her eyes. "I'm sure you'll find something perfect soon," she said. "You're Ginger, right? I think I stalked through your Instagram the other evening when I was looking up who else was invited to this thing." "Gosh," Ginger grimaced, tying the sticky bag shut. "You're more prepared than I am. I only know who a few of these amazing vendors are because my mother goes to the big farmers market in Lamington every other week." "Well, your photos look incredible," Katrina said, her brown eyes warm with earnestness. "Do you take them yourself? Because I might have to ask you for some tips on how to make my jars of delicious, but not hugely appealing fruit and vegetable sludge really pop the way your cakes do." She held up a finger before Ginger could answer. "Speaking of which..." Stepping away to her table, Katrina grabbed an already open jar of bright red jam and brought it over to Ginger. "It's perhaps not the same as the jam you were planning to use," she said, "but this is my summer berry conserve. Sweet, with a pleasant sharpness. Try some. See if it will work for your cakes." Ginger dipped the tip of her pinky into the jar to take a taste. It was exactly as Katrina had said, sweet, with a lovely, sharp twist at the end to stop it from being overwhelming. "Thank you so much," she said, cutting little divots out of the cupcakes she had made to be taster cakes, filling the hole with a spoonful of jam and then putting the sponge hat back onto the cupcake. "And I'm afraid I wouldn't be much help with photos. I've got a very talented associate behind the camera." "I thought my ears were burning," came the melodic Welsh accent of Rhys Morgan, history teacher and student-elected hunk of Chiswick Park Academy. Chapter 2. Even strolling up the nave of the chapel, nibbling on several samples from the cheesemonger, he was unreasonably good-looking. It didn't help that the fawn-coloured stone of the chapel softened the light, making Rhys' dark hair and beard glow ever so slightly. He'd abandoned his jacket somewhere and was wearing only a pale blue button-up shirt that clung to his broad chest and shoulders. "How goes the set dressing, Gin?" he asked, admiring the sugar animals. "My camera is in the car right now, but I can go get it if you want some shots." Involuntarily, Ginger felt her cheeks heat with a blush. After almost a year of friendship, peppered with subtle and then not so subtle flirting, she and Rhys had gone on their first official date 2 nights before. It had been wonderful, but Ginger hadn't seen him since she dropped him at home after a full day of museums, food, and talking about anything and everything. Now, faced with him looking entirely too delicious for the middle of a school day, she all at once found her hands to be unsteady. Squishing down too hard on the delicate vanilla sponge, she muttered a curse as the cake lost all shape, sending jam bursting out like some grisly set of organs. "I think I'm okay for now," she said to Rhys, hurriedly tossing the ruined cupcake into the bin and continuing with the next one. "Maybe after the TV crew is done, it should be golden hour by then." "Miss Burnet?" Ginger turned to see the new administrative assistant approaching officiously with her clipboard. Ava Clark had a face that could have been anywhere from 45 to 60, depending on the light, and she perpetually looked as if she had just stepped straight out of the 1950s. Style, 6, text align, left. Her dress today was a rather bland shade of beige, with only a tiny spray of blue flowers pinned near her collar. As usual, her silvering blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, making Ginger momentarily feel self-conscious about her own heat-flattened hair. "You and Miss Blythe are due to be spoken to by the television crew next," Ava said briskly, pulling a set of horn-rimmed glasses up from where they hung on a chain around her neck. "There are a set number of questions the crew will be asking that should have been provided in your welcome packs, but do be prepared for some ad-libs, as they say in the business." Ginger exchanged a swift look of amusement with Rhys, but kept her smile firmly buttoned down. Although a decidedly odd individual who seemed to live continually out of step with the rest of the world, Ava was excellent at her job and had kept every event that week running on time. "Thank you so much, Ava," Ginger said instead, giving a grave nod before picking up the plate of taster cakes. "Would you like one before you rush off again? You've barely stopped today." Watery grey eyes filled the lenses of Ava's glasses. "That's very kind of you. Thank you," she said, taking one of the delicate little cakes. "Such vibrant jam. It will look beautiful on the nation's television screens. You really should consider joining the local WI. Your skills would be most appreciated there." Rhys faked a cough to hide his involuntary laugh, turning away to stare intently at the squirrel, hazelnut clutched between its paws, on the autumn-themed tier of the cake. If Ava noticed, she didn't say anything. "I have Katrina to thank for the jam," Ginger said, forcing herself to ignore Rhys for fear that he would set off her own giggles. "Mine met a rather sticky end, and she kindly gave me some of her mixed summer berry conserve as a replacement." "There aren't plums in the conserve, are there?" Ava asked Katrina, suddenly looking at the cake as if it was a grenade. "I am terribly allergic." Katrina frowned in concern. "There are, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry." "Not to worry," Ava said briskly. Her posture snapping straighter, she saw the TV crew starting to make their way toward Ginger and Katrina's tables in the chancel. "I shall leave the two of you to your interviews with Ms. Sontag." Ava glanced at the nibbled cake in her hand. "I shall dispose of this somewhere, although it's such a shame to waste one of your delicious creations," she said to Ginger, then glanced down to the sticky patch on the floor. "Please make sure that is cleaned up quickly." Ginger gave a quick mock salute, but Ava had already hurried away. "She's an odd one for sure," Katrina said, shaking her head before snapping her fingers as she thought of something. "She did remind me, however." Ducking behind her table, Katrina began digging through a large denim-quilted handbag that looked homemade. Once again in control of his mirth, Rhys turned away from the cake, an admiration in his eyes that made Ginger blush anew. "I know you texted me last night saying you thought the robin on the winter tier looked top-heavy, but I don't see a feather out of place," he said, surprising her by pulling her into a swift but firm hug. "You knocked it out of the park, Gin. Well done." "Thank you," she muttered against the firm breadth of his chest, trying not to think about the fact that the light sandalwood cologne he used was quickly becoming one of her favourite scents. When he pulled away, Ginger was surprised to find herself feeling disappointed, despite knowing that the display would no doubt have already caught the eyes of the gossip mongers among both the students and the faculty. "I'll come back when it's quieter to take some photos of your masterpiece," Reese said with an almost shy grin. "Good luck on your TV debut." Ginger glanced away, tucking her hair behind her ear. "Do interviews for surviving a murder house not count as a debut?" she asked with a wry chuckle. Reese rolled his eyes, and Ginger once again found herself appreciating his ability to laugh at the dark parts of her past with her, rather than smothering her in pity. "Fine. Your TV debut for positive reasons," he amended, retrieving his cheese plate from the corner of her table and returning back out into the slowly moving tides of students, teachers, parents, and locals attending the event. "You're going to do great." Ginger watched him leave, a small smile on her face and a pleasant fluttering in her belly. She only looked away when Katrina hurried over, a scrap of paper in hand. "I wrote down an ingredients list for the preserve," she said, passing Ginger the note, "just in case there's anyone else who needs some forewarning." "We're back," Amelia announced, rushing up to Ginger, carrying a cloth and small bucket of steaming water. "Sorry, it took so long." Bonnie's expression was grimly unimpressed. "I'm afraid I got waylaid when I found Ollie Harrington and Samantha Cornwallis taking advantage of the entirely empty school to do what I can only describe as canoodling in the teacher's lounge." She tossed Amelia a set of gloves to protect her from the remaining shards of glass. "You know, I wouldn't say that giving impromptu safe sex talks to bored, horny, rich brats is something I particularly miss not having in my life over the summer. Might be wise to keep that to yourself. Not the kind of gossip you want caught on camera," Ginger muttered, nodding toward Sarah Sontag and the camera crew as they began setting up in the chancel. "Hello, my lovelies," Sarah said with a warm, wide smile Ginger had seen hundreds of times on her TV screen. "I'm so excited to shoot these segments with you both. Just give us a minute to get set up and then we'll be good to go." Immediately, Ginger believed Sarah's excitement to be real. It was, after all, Sarah's enthusiasm and genuine character that had rocketed her to popularity first as a children's morning TV presenter. Gradually, she'd moved into the feel-good, Sunday night-type programming like Country File, and most recently had gained her own segment for BBC Southwest, exploring the best that independent producers and preservers of art, food, culture and local knowledge had to offer. "She's smaller in real life," Bonnie whispered in an almost inaudible voice, as the petite brown-skinned woman returned to her crew and started directing them. "Mariah is going to go mad with envy when I tell her. She has all of Sarah's books." "Not the best way to promote tranquility in your marriage," Ginger pointed out, silently directing Amelia to tuck the bucket and cloth behind the hanging background for now, out of sight. "We had to leave the honeymoon period eventually," Bonnie joked. "It's now a challenge to see how much of my nonsense that angelic wife of mine can put up with on a daily basis." Ginger quickly flapped a hand at her friend to quiet her as Sarah Sontag wandered over to admire the cake. "This is absolutely magnificent," she breathed, staring in awe at Ginger's cake. "And you made all the sculptures yourself." Ginger nodded, glowing with pride. They really had hit the jackpot with the light that day, she mentally admitted to herself. The hint of gold that the whole month of September seemed to carry really was the best kind of light to view the creation in. The layer of fondant that encased the 4 different cake flavours within had been carefully coloured to match the soft cream shade of the Cotswold stone that made up the buildings of Chiswick Academy. Now it glowed as if Ginger had painted the entire structure in edible glitter, the animals seeming as if they were about to start breathing and leaping up and down the tiers. Bonnie nudged her forward a little, and Ginger realised she'd been standing there in silence, while Sarah Sontag had stared at her expectantly. "If you're ready, I'd love to ask you all about your journey to becoming someone who is capable of making such delightful, edible art like this," Sarah said, the full apples of her cheeks glowing as she smiled again. Ginger found herself easily drawn into conversation, explaining about the different flavours of the tiers, the process of creating the animal models, how her artistic background had bonded with her love of baking, and how she was now expanding into taking on unique custom cake orders and catering small events. It felt like a natural, casual conversation, despite the presence of the camera equipment, the boom mic hanging just above Ginger's eyeline, and the small crowd of students who naturally gravitated toward the camera crew out of curiosity. Finally, Sarah gave a thumbs up to the camera operator. "I think we've got everything we need with Ginger here. We'll do Katrina next." She turned back to Ginger, her smile remaining the same even though her voice relaxed slightly from its perfectly crisp presenter tone. "You were fantastic," she praised. "Thank you so much. I'm really hoping once people see your segment and this beautiful cake that you'll be getting more orders than you know what to do with." "Goodness," Ginger laughed, cheeks warming in response to the compliments. "If that happens, then I might actually have to move my workshop out of my garage and commit to getting a professional workspace for myself." "You should do that anyway," Sarah said firmly, brushing one of her short black curls out of her face. "I meet a lot of people, Ginger, who are all skilled in some unique way or another, but you seem like the kind of person who is going to make it professionally with this skill of yours. Try to make connections wherever you can with whoever you can, and always value what you can learn from other people. Now," she gave a cheeky smile that lit her almost turquoise-coloured eyes, "can I try one or two of these taster cakes? Despite all the deliciousness in this chapel, I've been so busy I've barely got to eat all day, and I'm famished." Ginger gladly offered the plate. "Take as many as you'd like," she said, "and it will help with your chat with Katrina since the jam in the cakes is hers." Sarah all but inhaled the first cupcake, sighing with delight. "I love days at work when I can count eating cake as interview research," she joked, taking a bite out of the second one. "When I'm done with the interviews, is there any way you can give me the secret to how you get your cake so light? Mine always seem closer to bricks than clouds." "I'd be happy to," Ginger said, already mentally drafting the blog post she would be able to write detailing her time with the beloved Sarah Sontag. Sarah stepped away to begin her interview with Katrina, and for a few minutes, Ginger basked in the feeling of success. This could be a big break for her, she realised. If even only a few dozen more people watched the segment when it was released and got in touch to commission a cake, it would be enough to push her over the edge from pseudo-professional baker into fully-fledged specialist cake maker. Her thoughts were interrupted, however, by a rapid series of gasps, followed by worried chatter and screams. Pivoting to look towards Katrina's table, Ginger watched in horror as Sarah Sontag stumbled to her knees, clutching her chest. For the briefest moment, her panicked eyes locked with Ginger's before they rolled back and she collapsed on the stone floor of the chapel, entirely motionless. Chapter 3. It was a stunning, golden evening. A murmuration of starlings swooped and palpitated in the sky to the west, their shapes turned black against the glowing light of the sunset. All the students, except the boarders, had left campus, and now only a few of the faculty remained. From the doorway of the chapel, Ginger watched with arms folded as the ambulance carefully and quietly wound its way down the long drive from the academy to the main road. There was no need for sirens or lights or a frantic rush to the hospital. Sarah Sontag was dead. Ginger felt Reese's presence before she saw him. The protective weight of his arm slid around her shoulders and, in this moment, she felt no self-consciousness about tucking herself into his side and leaning on the comforting solidness of his chest. "You know, it wasn't your fault, right?" he said quietly. "I know it's what you're thinking, but you need to stop thinking it right now." Ginger sighed sharply. "I can't help it, Reese," she said. "She was fine, then she ate one of my cupcakes, and then minutes later she's unresponsive on the floor. How can I not think it's my fault somehow? What if it was an allergic reaction and I didn't warn her about the ingredients? What if she somehow choked on a piece of cake? Choke on a bite of the fluffiest cake imaginable several minutes after eating it, Reese pointed out gently. Maybe leave the self-flagellating to the Catholics and the theories to the police, You don't need to leap in and solve the case, Gin. Not again. Immediately, Ginger thought of the previous October, when she had got swept up in solving the death of her friend, a teacher at the academy, by the name of Callum West. It had led her down some dark paths riddled with danger, and had nearly cost her everything. Her job, her friends, Reese, and nearly her life. I won't let that happen again, she said firmly, pulling away from Reese's side a little so she could look up into his face. I just want to know that it wasn't my fault. That's all I need to know. He sighed, reluctant acceptance visible in his dark eyes. I can understand that, he said, just as long as it doesn't consume you. It won't, Ginger promised firmly, meeting his gaze. I have no interest in repeating some of the toughest, darkest parts of my life. Arlington Manor last summer, and all that mess with Callum, Gus, Zoe, and Rebecca last October, it all still haunts me, Reese. You must know that. She looked down at his hand, uncertain whether she could hold it or not. Eventually, she went for folding her arms and leaning back against the warm stone of the doorpost, but keeping eye contact with him. The therapy and the friends and work and everything has helped, but there are still nights where I wake up shaking and sweating. She shrugged, trying to alleviate the tension creeping into her shoulders. There's still a random collection of emergency items in every bag I own, and I don't mean tampons or plasters. I mean, I own an unsettling number of recording devices and tiny tool sets with wire cutters, and one of those little things you have on your car keys that you use to cut the seat belt and break the window in case you ever get trapped after a crash. But you're not a quivering wreck of a person hiding away from the world, Reese said gently, stepping closer and putting a hand on each of her shoulders. You've got an amazing job here at the academy. You're setting up a business and living your life and killing people with my cake, Ginger reminded him flatly, chewing on her lower lip as a wave of anxiety crashed over her. Somehow, I don't think that'll be good for my job here or the cake business. Damn, I've got that big commission for the silver wedding anniversary next week, and I can't afford to give them the deposit back if they cancel because of this. Deep breath. That's not going to happen, Reese said, squeezing her shoulders again. You're the most tenacious person I know. Things might be a bit bumpy for a few days, but you didn't do anything wrong. Everything will be fine. Ginger's answer never made it to her lips when she spotted her brother Valerian's black Audi speeding up the gravel drive toward the academy. Behind him trailed a convoy of police vehicles that Ginger unfortunately knew from experience to be the crime scene investigators. Go and talk to him, Reese said before she could even excuse herself. He might have some news or some kind of information to calm your worry. I need to talk to some of the faculty anyway about how we're going to handle this alongside classes starting back. Thank you, Ginger replied softly as he removed his hands from her shoulders. And I haven't forgotten about your sister coming to visit this weekend. Bonnie and Mariah are on for dinner at my place if you and your mother and Sonia, Reese reminded gently. And you need to find out if your brother is bringing that guy he's been dating, but don't worry about that now. He looked over to where Valerian, or Ryan as he preferred, was parking in front of Melville House, the reception building of the sprawling academy campus. There are more pressing issues right now, Reese finished, raising a hand in greeting to Ryan as the elder Burnet sibling got out of the car. Let's hope we can maybe get some photos of the cake after the police have gone over the scene. Ginger hummed a non-committal agreement, hurrying down the front stairs of the chapel and across the car park to her brother. After a significant bump in his career path the previous year, Detective Valerian Burnet had returned to active duty and was now working in the larger town of Lamington about 40 minutes from Greater Chiswick. In an uncommon show of emotion, Ryan wrapped her up into a tight, all-encompassing hug before she could say anything. When he pulled back, the look he gave her was one of intense concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I've only got bare bones details from Clementine so far, but he said something about your cake somehow being involved." Ginger deflated, shoulders curling forward with a sigh. "I was hoping you had some reassurance waiting," she said flatly. "But yeah, Sarah was fine until she ate some of my cupcakes. Couple of minutes later, she can't breathe and collapses. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene, as I'm sure you know." Ryan swore softly, glancing around at the forensic team as they began to suit up, ready to assess the scene. One particular technician, a stocky, ginger-haired man with a neatly trimmed beard, lifted a hand in greeting. Ginger knew this to be Declan, the assistant pathologist her brother had been seeing for a few weeks. Ryan returned the gesture, but it was half-hearted. Ginger made a mental note to ask her brother, when they weren't at a potential crime scene, how things were going with Declan.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favour. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
Right now, however, she had some slightly more pressing questions. Chapter 4. Ginger pulled Ryan away from the bustle of people putting on the eerie white overalls, shoe covers, face masks and gloves that reduced the forensic team from recognisable people into eerie, faceless spectres. "You said Clementine gave you the basic info," she said. "What exactly did that entail? I might be able to fill in some gaps." She frowned. "Assuming you're working on this case? I thought you didn't cover this area anymore." Clementine, of course, was Detective Chief Inspector Jacob Clementine. The Burnet siblings had been somewhat good friends with him from the time all three of them were teenagers. Up until the previous year, Ryan had worked under the DCI as a detective. However, following her brother being put under internal investigation by the police after he'd become romantically invested in a woman who was a suspect in a case, a suspect who turned out to be guilty, things had become more strained between him and Jacob. "The Gloucestershire Chief Superintendent has a niece who goes to the academy," Ryan said, shuffling his polished shoes in the gravel of the visitors' car park. Not sure if she called him directly or if she called her parents and they called the chief super. But either way, it was quickly made clear that they wanted someone called in from Lamington, as we're perceived as more experienced, quote-unquote, big-town types. He gave a sheepish grin. "Unfortunately, all the more senior detectives are on holiday this week. There's only me and the rookies, so when Clementine called, saying he needed a DI, it turned out I was pretty much his best choice." Ginger winced. "I imagine he wasn't entirely thrilled about that." The previous year, when Ginger had broken Jacob's trust in pursuit of her own investigation into the death of her friend Callum West, a teacher at the academy, it had further weakened the friendship between the Burnet siblings and Clementine. Once the case had been solved, in no small part because of Ginger and Ryan's involvement, things had improved a little. Clementine had even advocated for Ryan's suspension to be lifted, with the only caveat being that he was no longer placed at the Greater Chiswick station. But Ginger knew that her friendship with Jacob Clementine would never be what it was. He certainly wasn't going to give her any information about what was going on with the Sarah Sontag case, even though Ginger was directly affected by its result. In fact, he'd likely not tell her for that very reason, no doubt remembering how things had unfolded the previous Halloween with the Callum West case. Ryan, however, was a different story. He gave a sigh and quickly glanced around before taking her by the arm and leading her even further away. Once they were out of sight of the chapel, hidden away in one of the small garden courtyards scattered around the sprawling campus of the academy, her brother released her and tucked both hands into his pockets. "There's not a lot to go on right now," he admitted. "But considering how high profile this case is going to be, there's going to be a lot of resources invested here. I mean," He shrugged helplessly. It's Sarah Sontag. She's adored nationwide and works for the BBC. As soon as the announcement is made, it's going to take over the news cycle for at least a week, especially since the cause of death was unexpected and apparently pretty distressing. Ginger slumped onto a sun-warmed wooden bench, scarred with graffitied names of students, both past and present. Her brother winced. Sorry to bring it up. Is this you, in the nicest way possible, trying to say that I'm going to be a suspect? She asked weakly, seeing Sarah fall to the ground in her mind's eye over and over again. Because, no, what happened to Sarah Sontag is definitely what I would call distressing, and I say that as someone who has found the body of a friend. Ryan didn't answer for a moment, looking back in the direction of the forensic vans. I'm not saying you'll be an immediate suspect, he said eventually, but it might be a good idea to ask for a few days off. Since it's one of their own who has died, you can bet that journalists and all kinds of media people are going to be camped out around the academy, or creeping through the town, looking for anyone connected. And when they find out that I might be even vaguely involved, Ginger said wearily, picking idly at the skirt of her sparrow-patterned sundress, all the gossip rags are going to be digging up everything they can about Arlington Manor and the case last Halloween. She heaved a sigh. This is going to suck. I'm sorry to intrude. The two siblings turned simultaneously to see George Harvey, the academy headmaster, hovering at the edge of the courtyard. He looked as if he had aged 10 years over the course of the afternoon. Unsurprising, considering that this was the second sudden death on campus during his time as headmaster. I couldn't help but overhear your brother's suggestion to take some time away from the academy, Miss Burnet, he said, walking closer, unconsciously tangling his fingers together in the manner he did when nervous. In this matter, I am in agreement. Not that I think you have anything to do with what happened to Miss Sontag, he said hurriedly, eyes going wide behind the lenses of his glasses with their thick black frames. But I think a little distance for the next few days would be best for you and for the school. Headmaster? Appearing as if by magic from behind a tunnel trellis heavy with honeysuckle, Ava waved a mobile phone in George Harvey's direction. We've got another concerned parent on the phone. The headmaster visibly deflated, another weight tossed onto the already crushing burden he carried. Getting to her feet, Ginger brushed dust from her seat and squared her shoulders. Don't worry about me, headmaster, she promised. Consider me out of sight and out of mind until things have a chance to settle. I'm sure the students will survive a week or so not knowing how to make meringues. Harvey gave her a thankful look over his shoulder as he hurried toward Ava and the phone. I shall call you myself to invite you back to campus, Miss Burnet, he promised. Thank you for your understanding, Ginger. As the headmaster and Ava hurried back toward the privacy of his office, Ginger turned to her brother and shrugged helplessly. I was hoping I'd be able to stay crime scene free for life, she joked wryly, but it seems I've relapsed. Might as well interview me now, Detective Inspector. Chapter 5. Ginger couldn't help but glance up at the viewing mirror placed on the wall opposite her. At lunchtime, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in the Greater Chiswick police station, she highly doubted the observation room would be packed with people. Still, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable, shifting on the flimsy plastic chair she'd been given to sit on. Internally, she chastised herself for fidgeting so much. Although she knew she had nothing to hide and was guilty of nothing, anyone who might be watching from behind the mirror no doubt found her inability to stay still at least slightly suspicious. When the door opened, Ginger startled so forcefully that the metal legs of the chair shrieked against the concrete floor. DCI Jacob Klimek, freshly returned from holiday, judging by his tan, gave her a look of mild amusement. A bit twitchy there, are you, Gin? He asked, putting down his novelty Cadbury's mug full of coffee on the table before taking his jacket off and hanging it on the back of his chair. Any particular reason you're so nervous to be in a police interview room? Not so long ago, Ginger would have assumed his words were a teasing joke. Now, however, looking at his inscrutable expression, she wasn't entirely certain if it was a joke or if he was already probing her reactions for some sign of guilt. "I'd say that being nervous in a police interview room is a pretty natural response," Ginger replied, opting for something non-committal until she was more certain about whether she was being treated like a suspect or a witness. "Did you go anywhere nice for your holiday?" "Mallorca," Klimek replied easily, settling into the chair opposite. The collar of his white button-down shirt shifted just a little, and Ginger couldn't help but notice a jarring tan line across the back of his neck by a strap of some kind. If she had to guess, probably a camera. "Did you get any nice photos out there?" she asked nonchalantly. "I know you're not the social media type, but I'm sure you took your camera with you." Klimek narrowed his eyes just a fraction, but there was a spark of humour there that finally let Ginger relax just a little. "I'd been back in the country for less than 24 hours, and I get the call about this mess," he said with a certain dark wry tone. "You seem to be a magnet for crime scenes. Some of the others had a betting pool going about how long it would be before you were connected to a case again." "I don't entirely know how I feel about that," Ginger replied with a laugh that she knew sounded slightly nervous. "But I can promise it's certainly not something I do on purpose. If I never saw another crime scene again, I'd be delighted." "After some of the things you've lived through and seen, I thoroughly believe you." Klimek leaned back in the chair, loosely folding his arms over his lean chest. "You've got to clear some things up for me, Gin, because right now, it looks like Sarah Sontag was poisoned by a cake that you made." Ginger felt the blood drain from her face and she rubbed her eyes. "The poor woman," she whispered, then looked up at Klimek, hoping he could see the innocence in her eyes. "And you're sure it was poison and not an allergic reaction?" An allergic reaction would be tragic, there was no doubt about that, and Ginger knew she would never fully forgive herself. But poison, on the other hand, carried with it a range of implications that were far more horrifying. Because Ginger knew that she hadn't intentionally put anything poisonous into the cupcakes, which were made with the same cake batter as her 4-tier masterpiece, which meant that some ingredient, somewhere in the baking process, had been compromised. Leaning her elbows on the metal-topped table, Ginger pressed the heels of her hands to her temples and stared at Klimek. His eyes were more guarded than she was used to. "How certain are you that it was the cake that killed her?" Ginger asked. "Because I swear, I didn't put anything in it that could have poisoned someone. Of course, I wouldn't." "And yet, Sarah Sontag was poisoned by your cake," Klimek pointed out, tone mild even though the words were relentless. "Help me fill in the missing pieces." His face softened a fraction. "Maybe it was an accident, Gin?" Ginger shook her head. "Impossible," she said. "What was the poison? Do they know? Can you even tell me?" Glancing quickly into the thin file he'd brought in with him, Klimek said, "Taxine alkaloids, according to the autopsy, most commonly present in trees from the Taxus baccata family." Her mind racing, Ginger frowned. "It was a natural poison?" she asked. "I mean, maybe some of the foliage I'd used to decorate the cake and the table might have been toxic. I thought it was all safe, but I could have made a mistake. Although that wouldn't explain how she ingested the poison." Klimek closed the file. I looked it up. Taxus baccata is apparently the common yew. Closing her eyes, Ginger tried to picture her display table in the chapel exactly as it had been on the day. Had there been yew? She'd asked Amelia to go and gather some foliage for decoration. Perhaps the girl hadn't recognised the highly poisonous tree for what it was. "The forensic team took everything on your table to do with the cakes and decoration, and are slowly working through testing it all for more signs of the poison," Klimek said. "Sorry about that, by the way. I saw the pictures and some of the little icing creatures down in the lab. You obviously worked really hard on it all." Ginger didn't reply, grieving the dozens and dozens of hours she'd spent in her garage creating the creatures, blasting cold air to stop the fondant, and chocolate softening. So far, they've only found the toxins in the jam, but they need to test everything. You know, for due diligence. The powerful conflicting emotions of relief and shock tore through Ginger at the same time. The jam, she breathed. Oh my gosh, the jam! The jam that Katrina had given to her. The mixed berry jam that would easily hide the inclusion of the incredibly poisonous, bright red yew-berries with their lethal, minuscule black seeds. But if it was indeed the jam, that meant it hadn't been her cake which had killed Sarah Sontag. Ginger sagged back, barely noticing Klimek's look of surprise at her sudden shift in emotion. The jam? He repeated questioningly. For a moment, the words stuck in Ginger's throat. She, of all people, knew the target she would be painting on Katrina's back by revealing the source of the jam. But Ginger was also aware that Klimek needed to know the jam had ended up in the cupcakes by chance, and certainly not by any design of her own. Resolved, she straightened once more, seeing Klimek do the same as he sensed her change in mood. If Katrina had put yew-berries into the jam, maybe it had been an accident? Perhaps she had mistaken them for some other berry. But the more she thought about it, the more doubtful Ginger became. To make jam required taste testing over and over again. Katrina would have ended up causing harm to herself long before the jam was ready to be put into jars. No, this was deliberate. The jam in the cupcakes wasn't the jam I brought with me from home, Ginger explained, confidently holding eye contact with Klimek as she spoke, knowing that she had nothing to hide and was free from blame. My jar broke. You should be able to see it happen in the footage from the security camera that covers the chancel, and the vendor on the table beside mine helped out. Her name is Katrina Blythe, and she runs Blythe Spirit, making jams and preserves and pickles and things. Klimek was writing concise shorthand sentences in his notebook. Looking up at her with his sharp eyes, he cocked an eyebrow. Anything else you think might be applicable or useful? After some thought, Ginger shook her head. Only that when I tried the jam, it tasted really good, she said. I guess I didn't eat enough of it to affect me, but poor Sarah ate several spoonfuls of it in the cupcakes. She said she hadn't really eaten anything that day. Maybe that's why the toxins affected her so quickly. Possibly, Klimek said ponderously, adding to his notes. I can't go into much detail, obviously, but the autopsy suggested something similar. Since she hadn't eaten, the stomach lining took in the poison quicker and triggered cardiogenic shock, or something like that. A pang of grief hit Ginger in the chest, as she thought about the absolute confidence in Sarah's voice when saying she was certain Ginger would succeed. To be poisoned only a few minutes later, after eating one of Ginger's cakes, seemed like an unnecessarily cruel twist of fate. Even though it wasn't my cake that killed Sarah, I feel at least partially responsible for being the reason she ate the jam, Ginger said quietly. I couldn't possibly have known, but still. For the first time since he'd stepped inside the interview room, and indeed for the first time in quite a while, Ginger saw her friend Jacob behind the professional mask of DCI Klimek. Reaching across the table, he took one of her hands in his, giving it a quick squeeze. If there was no way you could have known, Jin, then there is no way you can blame yourself, is there? He posited to her. Loading yourself up with unnecessary guilt won't help me, or Sarah, or Ryan while he works the case, and it certainly won't help you. Releasing her hand, he began gathering up his items, signalling the interview was over. If you just wouldn't mind steering clear of any more suspicious deaths or revenge plots or conspiracies, that would be excellent, Klimek said with a grin. Some of the folks around here are already calling you Ginger Pie or Ginger, private investigator extraordinaire. Getting to her feet, Ginger couldn't help but grin at the wordplay, even though she knew Klimek's light tone was covering a more serious order. He wanted her to stay out of the way and not get involved in the case at all. She shouldn't have worried about picking up on his subtext, for as he walked her out to the reception desk, he momentarily placed a light hand on her upper arm to bring her to a stop. "Seriously though, Ginger," he said, holding her gaze to be sure she could see how earnest he was being, "don't poke around in this one. You'll only end up bringing down a deluge of unpleasant media attention on yourself, on me, on the station, and on Ryan, who, now that you're on the road to being cleared, is going to end up being the poor sod in charge of this whole mess." "Even without all of those very good reasons," Ginger replied, "I have no intention of sticking my finger in this particular pie." She couldn't help but twitch a smile. "Even though you all might insist I'm the PI, I swear I'll be keeping my head and going about my usual life until I'm cleared to get back to work at the academy." But as she left the police station and walked to her car, Ginger couldn't help but entertain the curious questions that were beginning to burst to life inside her head like kernels of popcorn exposed to heat. Surely making a test batch of yew-berry jam counted as a culinary experiment, not anything to do with the case. She just wanted to know how someone would make yew-berry jam, not why. Driving out of the car park and heading home, Ginger couldn't help but reflect with a certain level of giddy guilt that her assertion to Klimek that she wouldn't look into anything was already becoming a difficult one to keep. Chapter 6. "Door is open!" Ginger shouted in response to the knock that resounded through the neat cottage later that same evening. "Just watch out for the cats when you come in." The door let out its typical rattle, the ancient hinges sighing as the door opened. From the kitchen, Ginger could barely see Rhys poke his head around the door. On Wednesdays, he tended to come to hers for dinner and music, and perhaps some cards or Scrabble. It was the one evening of the week his mother had friends visit the house she shared with Rhys. As much as he loved her, Rhys admitted that the last way he would choose to spend a midweek evening was hiding from his mother's book club. "Where are the cats lying in wait?" Rhys called suspiciously, closing the door behind him. "Nina isn't going to pounce from the top of the bookcase again, is she?" Before Ginger could answer, Rhys let out a yell of shock that, if he asked her later, she would assure him was entirely masculine. "No, she's hiding in the shoe rack," Ginger said, slightly distracted, taking a teaspoon of blood-red jam out of one of the 4 pots bubbling away on her beloved double-wide cooking range. It was later, the same day, as the interview with Klimek, and Ginger had fully immersed herself in her quest for knowledge. A quest, she sternly reminded herself, that had nothing to do with trying to help out with the case or solve Sarah Sontag's death. Now, in his socks, Ginger heard Rhys padding across the creaking boards and charmingly worn rugs of the main living room and toward the kitchen. "Miles is waiting for you in here under the table," she said by way of greeting her sort of beau as she appeared in the doorway looking pleasantly wrinkled after a full day's work. Maybe pretend to be scared when he comes out just so he doesn't feel left out. But Miles, the male of her sibling pair of British blue short-hair cats, was having none of her pity. He slunk out from his hiding spot, disappointment clear on his face despite his one eye that was milky with blindness. As he stalked away, Ginger swore she could hear him muttering under his breath about how she always spoiled the fun. "How was work?" she asked Rhys, stepping away from the cooker for a minute to get down the tin of cat treats as an apology. "Any other majorly traumatic events happened today?" "Only the usual level of traumatic." Rhys wandered over to peer at the pots, his voice following Ginger as she pursued Miles out into the living room to offer him a treat. "Yet another assembly about how to deal with trauma, accompanied by a presentation which I'm pretty sure Ava wrote for Harvey because it mainly seemed to suggest not going on social media ever again and reading a very specific edition of a very rare book of old hymns. I'm sure she meant well," Ginger said, taking a moment to scratch Miles behind the ears while he crunched up the treat mollified. "She's a little kooky and behind the times, but I like Ava." Rhys made a vague sound of indifference. "What's all this deliciousness bubbling away? Oh, there are little taster pots ready and waiting for me. How lovely. Panic sent Ginger racing back into the kitchen and violently knocking the spoon of jam from Reese's hand. The look he gave her was startled, with a hint of genuine hurt. I take it that this isn't at the tasting stage yet? He asked slowly, sunlight and brows drawing together. He took a cloth from the sink to wipe up the red smear across the floor. There is no tasting stage for this, Ginger said slowly, realising too late that she didn't have an explanation for her experiment that didn't make her sound mildly insane. It's actually poison jam. Yew berries, to be more precise. Reese rinsed the cloth out in the deep ceramic sink with its bright brass tap. And just to clarify some things for me, you're making inedible, specifically poisoned jam for what purpose exactly? He asked slowly, folding the cloth with more care than was necessary. Ginger bit her lip, knowing Reese well enough to know that when he began speaking very deliberately and taking excruciating care in his actions, there was the possibility of a storm of irritation on the horizon. No doubt he already had his suspicions about why she was making poisoned jam on a sunny Wednesday evening, but he specifically wanted her to say it. She started, not sure where the sentence or explanation was going. Just wanted to know for academic reasons what it would take to make a jam that had enough yew berries in it to kill someone. But that was also indistinguishable from regular jam. For academic reasons? Reese asked, crossing his arms. Internally, Ginger considered how such a move was really quite unfair due to how it showcased the corded muscles of his upper arms and made the material of his shirt strain slightly over his broad shoulders. Are you sure it's not for reasons to do with Sarah Sontag and the investigation into her death that I'm fairly sure you, implicitly or explicitly, promised me that you weren't going to get involved with? The only physical movement Reese made was to cock an eyebrow. However, his accent was getting thicker, which was usually the second indicator his annoyance was rising. It made it very easy to tell when he had a bad hand of cards, but wasn't ideal right now. One of the pots began to bubble over and Ginger hurried to stir it. With her back now to him and her hands occupied with cooking, Ginger found it much easier to explain her actions to Reese. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by saying that it has nothing to do with how Sarah Sontag died, Ginger said, hurrying on as she heard Reese draw breath to speak. But I also promise you that I'm not looking into the case, Reese. I promise. She trailed off, suddenly not entirely sure what she was trying to do. I guess I just want to see if there might have been something obvious that I missed, she said slowly. I keep feeling like I should have known, should have spotted it, tasted it. But I didn't. And now a wonderful woman is dead. Not because of you. Reese gently moved her aside and turned off all the burner rings. I'm guessing, since you're feverishly making jam, that it was the jam Katrina gave you that killed Sarah. Ginger nodded, briefly summarising what she'd learned that afternoon from Klimek. Then you definitely couldn't have known, Reese reiterated. Only this Katrina person knew it was poison and she chose to give it to you. God only knows why, but that's for the police to work out, not you in your kitchen using every pot you own. You have no reason to be involved. Except I kind of do, Ginger pointed out, finally voicing the thought that had been tumbling around her head all afternoon as she made the deadly delicacy. Because either Katrina knew what that jam would do to people, and she gave it to me to, frame me? Which is a terrifying thought because I've never met her before. Or, Reese prompted, slowly drawing Ginger to the charmingly ancient oak table. Or she also had no idea and I've just pointed the police in the direction of an innocent woman. Ginger sighed, rubbing her eyes. So, I'm involved to some extent, whether I like it or not. But I don't want to be, why don't we talk about and do something that doesn't involve murder and conspiracy? Reese offered after a few moments of soothing quiet. gently knocking his knee against hers, where they sat face to face on the kitchen chairs. I brought the homemade fajita seasoning my mum makes, and we can talk about strategies for making sure we all survive my sister's visit. Resting her chin in the palm of one hand, Ginger looked up through her lashes at Rhys, taking in the firm lines of his jaw and brows. His light brown hair was getting longer than usual, she noticed, and was starting to brush the collar of his shirt. For a sparking second, she had the urge to bury her fingers into his soft, slightly wavy hair and pull him into a kiss. The heavy sigh, laden with emotion, pulled Ginger from her blush-inducing daydreams. It took her a moment to catch up with the emotional shift that had happened while she had been staring at his mouth. Rhys had apparently taken her silence to mean that she was still thinking about the case, because now he was staring at the sticky pots with a worried frown on his face. If you feel like you must get involved with the Sarah Sontag case, even if only a little for your own peace of mind, he said slowly, just please be careful. Don't let it consume you like last year with Callum's death. I know we didn't know one another as well as we do now, but I remember how scared I was for you when I realised how far out on your own you were going. Ginger reached out and took his hand in hers reassuringly as she looked into his eyes. I promise I won't get caught up in it this time, she said gravely, punctuating her words by giving a firm squeeze. She liked the feeling of holding his hand, she realised. Now, let's get on with some dinner and talk about Sonia's visit. You must be starving, and I want to have a battle plan / rough itinerary of her trip to present to Bonnie and Mariah at the Fox's Den tomorrow evening. Chapter 7. Don't suppose you fancy a day out, do you, Mum? Ginger held the phone to her ear with her shoulder, needing both hands to lift the trailing ends of the basket of laundry out of Nina and Miles's reach. Her mother, Dorothy, hummed thoughtfully. Well, I was supposed to go fruit picking with Colin today, but then one of the guys from the Arboretum called. They asked him to assess a tree that needs trimming back and shoring up. Ginger rolled her eyes fondly. Colin Ashford, her stepfather, was the kind of man who was often asked to advise on things. There was clearly something about his tall, broad frame, the smile lines carved into his dark skin, and the deep baritone of his Caribbean accent that made him seem like the kind of dependable, sensible person to ask for an opinion. Isn't he supposed to be retired? Ginger asked, using her foot to slide Nina aside before hurrying into the garage and shutting the door. Ignoring the indignant meows from the other side of the door, Ginger crossed to the washing machine and dryer set against the back wall. I distinctly remember throwing a retirement party for him, she said jokingly down the phone. There was a cake. We invited a lot of people. It was on Halloween in the orchard. Her mother scoffed. You wouldn't think it with the amount of time he spends in the woods with all his old tree surgeon buddies. Says he's going for a walk with the dog, then comes home 5 hours later, smelling of chainsaw oil with wood chips in his hair. So, is that a yes to my offer of a day out? Ginger started the washing machine, then returned to the cottage, the empty basket propped under her arm. I'd love to go fruit picking, especially if they have nice pears. Rhys's sister, Sonia, flies into Bristol tomorrow, and I'm making my pear, walnut and goat's cheese tartlet for dinner. It needs to impress, since not only am I feeding Rhys's family, but Maggie is coming down from Stratford and Bonnie and Mariah are coming, and I'm going to see if Ryan and his current boyfriend want to join in too. So, if I can use fresh pears to make it a showstopper, I'd rather... Nina, you little brat! Stop scratching the rug! I bought you a scratching post for a reason. With a guilty little chirp, Nina flattened her ears against her head, eyes wide with dilated pupils. Miles, from his place on top of the bookshelf holding Ginger's extensive record collection, looked down at his sister disdainfully, trailing his tail down over the edge of the top shelf like he was dangling a baited hook. Now, you know what it was like trying to raise you and your brother, Dorothy said dryly. Deal with the ruffians and then come and pick me up. Ginger sighed, but she was grinning as she did so. I'll get all the zoomy energy out of Nina and then I'll be on my way, she promised, taking the feathered stick toy that Nina so enjoyed attacking from its place in the cat toy box. Immediately, the cat flattened herself to the floor, hunting mode engaged. Enjoy, I'll see you later, Dorothy chuckled, hanging up the phone. Keeping her eyes locked on Nina's, Ginger tossed the phone onto the sofa and braced herself for combat. Let's see how lucky you're feeling, punk, she growled out in a mock cowboy accent, beginning to flick the bright pink feather back and forth across the floor. Nina twitched her tail in response, gleaming golden eyes following the movement. Then, quick as lightning, she pounced at the quivering feathers and the game was on. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I see Nina is still too fast for you, Dorothy teased as she fastened her seatbelt in the passenger seat of Ginger's car. Ginger grimaced, sticking down the plaster she'd put over the latest cat claw scratch on her hand. It was a team effort, she muttered. I was so busy watching Nina that I didn't see Miles coming in from the side. Little goblin. Dorothy laughed heartily, and Ginger couldn't help but smile in response. People commonly commented how similar the two of them looked. They shared the same warm hazel eyes, wavy brown hair, and slightly gangly limbs. Their smile lines fell in the same places, and her father, Ian, always swore that they had the same nose. But neither woman could see it. Often, Ginger felt as if she was looking into a mirror that showed her the future when she looked at her mother's face. She could only hope to age just as gracefully. As they began driving to the fruit farm, with Dorothy giving directions from memory, Ginger found her thoughts flitting from topic to topic. Her interview with Klimek the day before. Sarah Sontag. Dinner with Reese and Sonia and their mother tomorrow. The poisoned yew jam she had carefully disposed of to be certain that the cats wouldn't eat any. I said left, Dorothy pointed out gently. Never mind. You can take the next left and we'll work our way back to where we need to be. Sorry, Ginger apologised, hurriedly taking the next left as instructed, veering around one of the many large potholes that littered the Gloucestershire roads. And please sit properly. Can't believe I'm having to give a car safety talk like you're 5. Pulling a mocking face, Dorothy uncrossed her legs, bare feet momentarily getting tangled in the patterned burgundy and white harem pants she was wearing. I can tell something is on your mind, she said, but we can... Oh, take a right here. But we can talk about it when we get to the farm. Nothing like having busy hands to help loosen the tongue and ease the mind. Ginger gave her mother a sideways glance. I know you have the maternal superpower to know when something is going on with me, Mum, but it's not exactly a secret that I watched a woman die in front of me at the beginning of this week. It's not difficult to guess what is on my mind. She drove around another huge pothole. And, you know, using June's sayings gets me in my soft spot. And it was true. June Nelson, a longtime friend of the Burnet family and former owner of Ginger's cottage, had been full of wisdom after almost 7 decades of life. For 6 months, Ginger had served as her live-in carer and companion until June's sudden death 18 months prior. A cut from a rusty nail while digging in her beloved garden had rapidly become septicemia, and in less than a week, June had passed away, leaving Ginger the caretaker of the cottage, its garden, and her memory. All right, Missy, less of the sass, Dorothy said, raising her hands in surrender. We can save the conversation for the orchard. I think we're almost there. She pointed to a large wooden arrow painted with the words, Pick your own, in bold blue letters. Ginger turned through the open gate that was adorned with ribbons and laminated paper fruits that looked as if they had been coloured in by a child. You find somewhere to park and I'll go and get us some baskets, Dorothy said, slipping her feet back into the battered pair of sandals she'd kicked off into the footwell. I think we should start with the late strawberries and then hit the gooseberries, the red and black currants, and then go to the orchards. Ginger gave a mock salute to her mother as she climbed out of the car. Whatever you say, General. Dorothy stuck out her tongue at her daughter in a very mature manner, eliciting giggles from Ginger. Shaking her head fondly, she watched Dorothy stride off towards the weathered, open-front hut with 2 equally rustic signs saying, "Get baskets here," in red, and "Pay inside," in yellow. Parking the car, Ginger grabbed her floppy straw hat from the back seat, aware that even though summer was on its way out, the sun would be unyielding out in the open fruit fields and in the orchard. Shaking back her long hair, she set it on her head and strolled towards the little hut. However, that was when she noticed the little table of produce off to the side. Kept in the shade under an awning, the little glass jars of jams, jellies, preserves, and pickles gleamed invitingly, the sign above them proclaiming to all that they flew under the banner of blithe spirit. Ginger immediately felt as if she had swallowed a bag of rocks. Her mother had inadvertently brought her to Katrina's fruit farm. Chapter 8. Swearing under her breath, Ginger was more grateful than ever for her large, drooping hat. Part of her wanted to pull her mother out of the hut, drag her back to the car, and drive off as fast as she could. But another, more sensible part of her pointed out that there was no need for such a dramatic course of action. "There's no need to panic," she whispered to herself, aware that she was rooted to the spot, unmoving in the middle of the dusty track that led out of the farm's fruit fields. "Sure, I've got trust issues, and for good reason, but I have no evidence that she was trying to frame me. Katrina might not have been trying to kill Sarah at all. It might all just be a big mistake." Forcing herself to keep walking, Ginger fought to keep her sudden paranoia under control. "Just because I've had people try to kill me before, and I've been suspected of committing arson and murder because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, doesn't mean that's what is happening with that bloody jam," she hissed at herself. "Now get a grip. Go pick fruit with your mother and just make sure she doesn't buy any of the jam. Just in case." The sound of a child shrieking with joy, accompanied by the excited yapping of a dog, drifted to her ears on a breeze. The sounds caught on Ginger's already frayed nerves, and her gaze snapped toward the sound. It was coming from behind a high hedge that surrounded the idyllic farmhouse at the centre of the fruit farm, split with an arched trellis and a sweet little wooden gate. As Ginger was looking, however, Katrina herself came charging out of the gate, a phone pressed to her ear. The other hand was massaging her temples in a way that spoke of intense stress. On instinct, Ginger dropped to one knee, hiding her face with the brim of her hat, and pretended to fiddle with her shoe. The hot, flat farmyard helped the sound to carry well, and so Ginger suddenly found herself eavesdropping on the tense conversation Katrina was having. "Sorry, I just needed to step away from Alfie for a minute," she said, voice heavy. "He might be my son, and I love him, but he's trying my last nerve today. But he's 9, so that's really no surprise." Katrina's voice sounded far more strained and sharp than Ginger remembered from their conversation in the chapel. It quickly became obvious why, as the older woman sighed. "I've been told I need to go to the police station in Lamington for an interview with the detectives who are looking into Sarah's death," she said. "It's honestly the last thing I need right now, considering the other court case I'm already dealing with. He's accusing me of all kinds of nonsense, saying he was poisoned, that I'm an unfit mother for Alfie. Ex-husbands are just a constant delight, aren't they?" Although feeling terribly exposed in the middle of the car park, Ginger couldn't help but prick up her ears at this detail. Another court case? More accusations of poison? Either Katrina was having a run of very poor luck, or she was attempting some kind of master plan that was going very poorly. Ginger instantly felt guilty for the thought, chastising herself for casting such aspersions without any real evidence. Thanks to Arlington Manor and Callum's death last year, she of all people knew what it was like to get swept up in legal proceedings and bewildering court cases. "Look, if they're not going after Ginger who made the cakes, then they're coming after me," Katrina snapped, glancing back toward the house as the barking and giggling reached new volumes. Ginger took the opportunity to run in a crouch to hide behind a large barrel. She knew she was actively listening in now, but Katrina had mentioned her, so it was justified, right? If it was the jam that killed the poor woman, then I have no idea how, Katrina said, suddenly sounding defeated. In fact, the more I think about it, I'm not even sure it was my jam. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the phone spoke, and Ginger took those precious seconds to process. If the jam hadn't come from Katrina, then where the hell had it come from? The other member of the conversation apparently asked a similar question as Katrina let out a frustrated sigh. I don't know where it could have come from, all right. It looked like one of my small taster jars of the summerberry conserve that I was going to put out, so it didn't have an actual label on it. I only handed it to the cake maker beside me because her jar fell on the floor. Katrina huffed a laugh, shoving some of her greying hair out of her face. Hey, maybe it was the cake and I'm getting stressed over nothing. I researched this Ginger Burnet some more, and she's been involved in far more murder cases than any regular person should. Anger pulsed hot through Ginger's chest at this, and for a split second, she wanted to step into view, but she resisted. It wasn't like Katrina was wrong, she thought wryly. There came a sudden yowl of pain from the hidden garden, and Katrina rubbed at her face again wearily. I'll call you back, my love, she said. I think Alfie provoked the dog into nipping him again. There was a pause. Yes, I'll let you know what the interview is about. This involves you too, darling, and don't worry, we'll get rid of these irritating obstacles soon enough. Well, that's wonderfully reassuring, Ginger muttered as Katrina hurried out of earshot back toward the house. Ginny, dear, what are you doing down there? Glancing up guiltily as if she was a child caught red-handed doing something she wasn't supposed to, Ginger found her mother looking down at her with a somewhat bemused expression. I was tying my shoe, she said, trying to be nonchalant as she got to her feet. Dorothy cocked an eyebrow. You're wearing pull-on ballet flats, darling, she pointed out. Oh! Ginger looked down, flushing as she remembered that she was indeed wearing her favourite pair of flats, which were entirely devoid of laces. Yeah, I forgot about that. Shall we just pretend this never happened and go pick some fruit instead? Dorothy suggested, holding out a dark green cardboard basket with a thin metal handle. I think that's for the best, Ginger agreed quickly, taking the basket. So, you wanted to do strawberries, gooseberries, both kinds of currants, and then hit the orchards? The two of them set off into the pleasantly hot afternoon, arm in arm, swinging their empty baskets loosely by their sides. The baskets didn't remain empty for long, however, and the afternoon passed in a blur. The sun was hot, the ripe fruit gleamed, and the air was perfumed with the musky sweetness of the gently decomposing windfall crop. When Ginger and her mother returned to the car park, laden down with their third batch of fruit that day, they were sun-kissed and laughing, mouths sticky with the juice of quickly stolen samples they couldn't resist. I don't know if I'll be able to eat anything at pie and mash night down at the Fox's Den this evening, Ginger groaned, setting down the two overflowing baskets of pears she'd picked in addition to several baskets of strawberries, red and black currants, apples, and a surprise basket of damsons from a tree in the hedgerow at the back of the orchard. I think I'm full to the brim with fruit. Dorothy glanced at her watch. If you're meeting people at the Fox's Den, we'll need to hurry home, she said. It's nearly 6 already. We usually close at 5, said the lanky teenage girl behind the counter as she weighed each of the baskets to calculate the price. But you looked like you were having so much fun out there. I didn't have the heart to come and tell you. Both Dorothy and Ginger immediately stumbled over themselves to apologise, but the girl waved it off. Honestly, it's fine, she said, typing up the total on the rattling cash register that wasn't even attached to the simply constructed service counter. My mum owns the place, and she doesn't mind. Better than having the fruit go over and rot in the fields. Ginger bit down on her tongue to resist the urge to ask Katrina's daughter any kind of questions. Not only would they likely come off as weird rather than casual, but Ginger had promised Reese and Ryan and Klimek that she wouldn't get involved in the case. And asking questions definitely counted as getting involved. So she stayed quiet. However, as she drove out of the gate, her mother already half dozing in the passenger seat, and the back seat lined with baskets of fruit, Ginger caught sight of Katrina feeding a large fire on an open patch of grassland by the gate. The smoke was thick and heavy, but Ginger was still able to see that Katrina was burning freshly cut boughs of foliage and lumps of tree stump. The detail that wormed its way into the back of Ginger's mind, like a maggot in an apple, was the fact that the branches were all adorned with bright red berries that identified the trees as yew. Now, why would Katrina be burning a huge amount of freshly cut yew trees if she had nothing to hide? Chapter 9. Nearly an hour later, Ginger crashed through the door of the Fox's Den. It was pie and mash night, a famed night of the week in Little Chiswick's favourite pub, and the place was packed. People were chattering, eating heaping plates of freshly cooked pies and creamy mashed potatoes, and sipping on pints of local beer while the pub's owner Stu walked from table to table, chatting with the regulars. Finally, spotting the familiar breadth of Reese shoulders and the gleaming copper afro belonging to Bonnie's wife Mariah, Ginger weaved between the tables toward the booth that her friends had secured for the evening. I know, I'm so late," Ginger panted, flopping down into a miraculously empty chair at her group's table. "I'm sorry, I was out with my mum and the afternoon just disappeared. Oh my gosh, Maggie! When did you get into town?" For Maggie McFelder, the short, sweet, sharp-tongued Scottish Filipino woman that Ginger was lucky enough to call her dear friend, was indeed squeezed into the booth beside Reese. "Let me out," she insisted, half shoving him out. "It's time for a Scottish shortbread and ginger snap sandwich." The two squealing friends hugged fiercely, swaying from side to side, watched by a beaming Mariah and Bonnie and a bemused Reese. "I didn't think you were coming down until tomorrow afternoon," Ginger asked incredulously. "My house is a mess. I don't have the guest room set up or anything." Maggie flapped a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about housing me, sweets. I've got an Airbnb in Greater Chiswick." "But don't you have a show in the Black Box Theatre tonight?" Ginger asked, momentarily only half listening. From over by the bar, Stuart Mill, the proud owner of the Fox's Den, caught her eye, mimed taking a drink, pointed at her, and raised his eyebrows. The question was obvious. Did she want a drink? With a grin and a thumbs up, Ginger pointed to herself and then the rest of the table. A round for all of them. Stu by now knew their beverages of choice. "We would be in the Black Box this evening, usually," Maggie said, shooing Reese to slide out along the bench of the booth and ushering Ginger to sit beside him. Only one of the main spotlights fell out of the ceiling in the middle of a rehearsal this morning. She grabbed her pint of beer and drained half of the remainder. "So, the Black Box is closed until that's fixed up, and they've checked out the ceiling for any structural weaknesses. Figured I'd take the opportunity to leave a day early for my little break." "I just feel sorry for the lighting team," Bonnie said, clearing aside empty glasses as Stu arrived with a tray of frothing pints. "I imagine the theatre wasn't thrilled." Don't be," Maggie said with a grin that made her silver lip ring catch the light. "The lighting crew for this show are the arrogant sort. I told them that they were putting too much weight in one spot, but no, I'm just the sound designer and shouldn't have an opinion." Squeezed in beside Reese, their thighs pressed together in the limited space, Ginger gave him a shy smile. "Are you lot finally ready to eat?" Stu asked in his broad Gloucestershire accent, eyes twinkling. "I've got your usual orders set aside, just waiting to go into the oven." "You're too good to us, Stu," Ginger said gratefully before taking a deep draught of her cider. "And did you manage to ask your daughter if she wants that cake for her son's birthday? I've got a few cute ideas already sketched up from what you said little Dylan is interested in." Her stomach sank as Stuart's face took on an expression of nervous awkwardness. About that," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's actually decided to go with Creature Comforts, the cake place in Lamington. Just because the Sarah Sontag story is all over the place right now, and apparently some gossip rag found out your cake was apparently the cause of death and, well, she just doesn't want any drama from the other mums over the cake, and although she wasn't looking at them, Ginger could feel the pitying looks she was getting from her friends around the table. She forced a smile, even though she knew she was flushing with embarrassment. "It's fine, Stu," she assured him, cutting off the ramble. "People worrying about being poisoned by the cake would put a real damper on the party. I hope Dylan has a nice birthday." Ducking his head, obviously uncomfortable, Stu hurried away, muttering something about getting their food ready for them. "I know I already made all the expected jokes to lighten the mood when you texted me about the Sarah Sontag thing," Maggie said, drawing on the sticky tabletop with drips of condensation from her glass. "But I can make them again if it will lighten the mood." Ginger groaned, thudding her forehead onto the table and covering her head with her arms. "Which eldritch deity did I accidentally piss off? Because no regular uncursed person would get tangled up in this many crime scenes." "Why don't we change the subject?" Reese suggested, and Ginger felt the comforting weight of his hand pat her on the head several times. "Perhaps how we all survive my sister's visit when she arrives on Saturday. Or we can talk about how Ava, the headmaster's miracle-working assistant, is now also the RE teacher," Bonnie said, tapping insistently on Ginger's hand to get her to pay attention. "Hey, stop moping and listen to the gossip." "It's pretty good gossip," Mariah added, nudging Ginger's glass into her hand. "Oh, I'm always here for gossip," Maggie said. "Is there ever a dull moment at this school you lot work at?" "Sometimes," Reese replied mildly, "but not often. It's a school full of hormonal teenagers with rich parents. The drama practically writes itself." With a show of faux reluctance, Ginger groaned and dragged herself to sit upright. She sat back, arms folded, and listened as Bonnie unveiled the latest development at the academy. "So, you know how Brett freshened up the curriculum, even though a few of the parents made unhappy noises about it," Bonnie said, referring to the effortlessly cool American RE teacher who was also the assistant coach for the girls' lacrosse teams, by his first name rather than as Mr. Simmons. And how those same parents melted in the face of his charm, and how they eventually agreed with his argument that the students can go to the chaplain to learn about religion, and that his class was to expand their understanding of the world through the lens of faith, belief structures, and the philosophy of religious texts. Maggie found herself. "Check out the brain on Brett. Please tell me that he hasn't died under mysterious circumstances as well. I want the chance to see how flustered he gets during a conversation about how religion has been used to erase and control indigenous cultures across the planet." "I'd enjoy being there for that as well," Mariah said, lifting her glass to tap it against Maggie's. "Especially since, despite what the name suggests, Brett is First Nations himself and has some very interesting thoughts on that topic." "Yes, we all agree. We love Brett," Reese said, folding his arms. Ginger had to hide a smile. Was Reese sulking a little about no longer being the cool new teacher on campus? "What happened to Brett?" she asked, subtly shifting slightly closer to Reese so their shoulders brushed. "Why has he been replaced by Ava? She's sweet, but I imagine she doesn't exactly hold the same views as him." "You would be correct," Bonnie said, eyes lighting up with dramatic flair as she set the scene, except that she was the only one available to step in and offer to take over the class for a few days after Brett started throwing up uncontrollably this morning and then passed out in the dining hall. "Is he okay?" Ginger frowned. "Seems a little early for the return to school bugs to start circulating. We've only been back less than a week." Bonnie shrugged. "No one else on the faculty or any of the students have come down with anything yet. He blamed it on food poisoning from that dodgy fried chicken place in Greater Chiswick." Reese winced. Yes, I made the mistake of eating there once when I was visiting to view potential rental houses. It's the kind of mistake you only make once." "Well, It looks like he's going to be off for a few days at least, Bonnie said. Not long enough to make it worth hiring a substitute, since it turns out Ava is sort of trained as a teacher. From all accounts, she did well with the class this afternoon, Reese chipped in. Bonnie snorted into her beer. If Bai did well, you mean she bored the kids to tears? A bunch of my Year 10 art classes had her right before mine, and they all looked comatose as they walked into my classroom. I'm more worried about Harvey being unable to find anything in his office, Reese said. Ava did such a good job of organising his desk and his schedule, but I think she forgot the crucial step of telling him where everything was and how it worked. I ended up having to escort that woman Katrina, you know, the one who was selling all those jams at the Harvest Festival, to his office this morning because he completely forgot they had a meeting. Ginger nearly choked on her drink. Why had Katrina been visiting the headmaster?
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.